fired her yet? No, I haven't. Would you like me to go ahead and do that for you? Gee, if you have no problem doing it, super, I'll do it. He spins around in his desk. He picks up an old desk phone. He dials HR. He said, would you please send me Gary's next paycheck? Turned around. I was like, what? He said, Gary, we do the stuff we like for free. We get paid to do the stuff we don't like.
Top leaders, meaningful conversation, actionable advice, bulldoze complacency, ignite inspiration, create impact. Produced by the Southwestern family of companies. This is the Action Catalyst.
Are you interested in advertising with the Action Catalyst? Our listeners could be hearing about your brand right here, right now. For details, shoot us an email at info@theactioncatalyst.com.
Today's guest is Gary Kusin. Gary was the co-founder of Babbage's, now GameStop, and also served as the president and CEO of Kinko's, ushering in its acquisition by FedEx. Now, in his book, Always Learning, Gary shares pivotal moments, valuable lessons, and leadership principles for everyone from the aspiring entrepreneur to the seasoned CEO.
Well, hey, Gary, it's super nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you also. I'm at your mercy.
Well, thank you. You may come to regret that, but in the meantime, thank you. So I'm super curious. I'm going to just jump right in out of the gates. In your book, Always Learning, I think that's such an interesting perspective because folks often would look at your background and go, what does he possibly have left to learn? Tell me a little bit about where the idea behind the book came from. Walk me through some of that.
Sure, be glad to. So after I sold Kinko's to FedEx, and after the 2 years that I integrated it into FedEx, reporting to Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx, I was trying to decide what I wanted to do next. And I started getting a lot of pressure because of the way the Kinko's turnaround happened and a lot of things about that from a lot of interesting quarters saying you have to write a book. This would be a very big book. And I said, I have never been good about talking about myself, but I'm a big introvert and I would just as soon not be in the limelight. And so I really kind of pushed back, but they were really pushing pretty hard. I told everyone, no, thank you. I am looking forward to my anonymity, and that's it. And I let it go. Fast forward to the last year, had our 11th grandchild, and our view of the world is quite different, both my wife and me. We decided while we still could, we wanted to write a memoir. That's where I started. And through a lot of friends who were authors and a lot of people, I ended up meeting with some publishers. I went through the whole drill and I found a spectacular editor that I really wanted to work with. And I started pounding away on a memoir, gave it to Maria, and she came back to me, and she's a highly experienced person in the book industry, a real book pro. And part of my belief and my talk track about my life is essentially I'm the luckiest SOB in the history of the world. I have fallen up in everything that's ever happened to me good, pure luck. Well, Maria pushed back. I read intention on every page, and I have a hard time reconciling the intention that I see that you have written in your own words about your own life with your thought that you have just been lucky and fallen up. She said, I don't believe that. I would like you to rethink how you have thought about your life. Luck is what happens when opportunity meets preparedness. That stuck with me. And my book took on a very different intentional look and frankly morphed into more about my business. I'm a mentor. That's the one thing that came out of my whole career that I love the most. And there are reasons I track through all of those in the book, but I've had over 1,000 mentoring sessions the last 20 years. And so this book is a way for me to mentor more broadly. In my podcast, the same thing. All I'm trying to do is level people's playing fields who might not have had the advantages I've had in my career, because that is my joy. It's my love. I spoke a month ago and I wrote about this recently on LinkedIn, but I spent an hour with the 8th grade of a charter school in St. Paul, Minnesota, who were all Somali refugees. And one little boy had his hand up and I said, yes, because I was asking for questions. And he said, when did things get better for you? Now think about that question. It stopped me dead in my tracks, and I was able to just talk to this young man about things that I did at his age, what I learned, and what I felt was a way forward for anybody who is trying to figure out how to better themselves. It filled me up. That interaction with that young man was that's what I lived for.
There is so much I want to unpack. So let me circle back to these leadership principles: respect, alignment, accountability. What else?
Well, I actually do alignment and accountability is 1 and 2. For me, it's critically important in any company for everyone to understand what are we trying to do here, and to understand here's the mission. There's the flag on a distant hill. That's the flag we need to take. We're going to take it. And then why they're so linked is you can't give responsibility without authority. And so many companies do that they tell someone you've got to get this done. And then when you start to do it, someone else tells you can't do that. That's a misalignment. It'll destroy everything. So alignment, and then have a culture that does distribute authority. Then you can move into respect for others. And that means that. And at TPG, where I did a nice stint as a senior advisor, they had a sign in their lobby that said, "No assholes allowed." That's, I think that's pretty straightforward, and you can figure out what that is. And the honesty and integrity is a requirement, but there are a lot of people out there who like to cut corners, and I'm never a part of that. And the last one is continuous improvement. But my co-founder at GameStop and I've been talking about the book, obviously, and he really thinks I should rethink that, and I am, to make a continuous change. Because we could have been accused at GameStop of being excellent with continuous improvement, because we were. But we should have been thinking change, because we came in at the dawn of a new industry. We were the first software store in the world when our first store opened. And the things we did to start were right at the start. But 10 years later, every one of our kind of pillars of our business needed to be reevaluated, every single one of them. And all we were trying to do was be better, smarter, faster in what we were doing, and continued to succeed. But we were missing the very large and important aspects of change.
Absolutely. Next thing I want to touch on is this idea of toxicity. How and when do you recognize it? How do you change it? Just talk me through some of that.
The key question you're asking there is, how do you change it? And I will get to that in a minute. It is pretty obvious to see when there is a culture that people talk down to people in an organization, or they yell, or they scream, or they belittle people. There is no reward and recognition. There is an expectation that people might work all hours, be available all hours, and those kinds of things. And not want to pay people, keep all the money for themselves, all that kind of stuff. How do I change that? In one case, I left. In life, there are good reasons and there are real reasons. I ended up having a good reason, and I'm not going to get into it any more than that. In one particular company I was involved with, I had a good reason for leaving, but it wasn't the real reason. And the real reason was I couldn't stand the tone at the top. And unfortunately, I'm at the top also, so that I was getting guilt by association, and I decided I didn't want to go into hand-to-hand combat with the other top leadership. So it was easier for me, because I wasn't at all concerned about being able to find something to do, because that's never been a problem for me. And I decided I can create a new situation for myself. And I had a good reason. Everybody believed it. That's great. But it's tough. That's one thing people know about me. And when I was at TPG, again, as a senior advisor for 13 years, and that means I helped assess companies to see whether we should buy them or not, those that we bought. If I wanted to join the board, I could. I could be lead director. I could be executive chairman. I could be whatever I wanted to be. But in those situations, I was very clear very quickly if I saw toxicity at the top. I had very difficult conversations with CEOs, presidents, and other people, and I have no problem doing that. I just close the door and I sit down and I say, I'm about to have a very difficult conversation with you. And when you say, I'm about to have a difficult conversation with you to someone, they kind of sit up, go, something's coming. I need to, and they focus, and you get a very different kind of focus when you start a conversation like that. And I would tell them, not on my watch, not on TPG's investment. We're not going to do things that way. And you need to understand that. And if you have an issue with that, then let's talk about how to gracefully get you out. And I had no problem having those difficult conversations because I'm having them with people who are inherently difficult, who have been part of the toxicity, who seem to not understand what their presence is like, how they're being received by other people. So I had a bunch of those conversations.
Again, the wisdom that just comes from that. So many people from a leadership perspective talk about the difficulty of difficult conversations. And you just gave beautiful language. Hey, we're just going to have a difficult conversation.
Yeah. And I'll give you another lesson I learned along the way that helped me with that. Actually, that lesson came from Jack Welch. And I asked him, I was having quarterly business reviews with him, and I asked him, I was very curious. I had assembled an entirely new management team, and 12 months later, I'd replaced half of them. And I said, I feel very guilty about that, Jack. And so give me something to think about as I think about, am I a failure at recognizing talent? What did I do wrong or what did I do right? And I learned from him, first of all, he said 50% is completely average. He said, I'm not going to tell you good job, but I'm not going to tell you bad job either. Because when you're rebuilding a senior team from the ground up in a turnaround situation, you won't know. If you lose half of them, that's average. He said, now the second time around, since you now understand the business much more closely and the replacement kind of people, they should have different characteristics. So I learned about that. But the best one I ever got was the first time I ever fired anybody. It was one of those things that has stuck with me forever. So I started a new job in Sacramento for a different department store. That I'd started in the department store in San Francisco. They owned another division in Sacramento. They offered me a big promotion to go there. My boss in the new situation, when I sat down, he said, look, I've been here for 3 months longer than you, and I've identified the areas that are weak. We need to make changes. And I see these few people as needed. We probably need to change them out, figure out what you think, and let me know. So one of them, I came to him and said, you are right. I need to fire her. She's clearly not going to be the person to get us to the next level. He said, great. I couldn't bring myself to fire her. I was 26. She was much older. She had a family. I didn't know how to do it. I just didn't know how to do it. And every week at my weekly meeting, he would say, hey, Gary, have you fired her yet? No, I haven't. Finally, 6 weeks later, after asking me half a dozen times, he said, you know what? I've done this for a long time. I'm obviously more experienced than you. This is not my first rodeo. I'm the one that identified her. Would you like me to go ahead and do that for you? And no, I'll do it. I promise you, Marvin, I'll do it. He said, well, I have no problem doing it. So I said, well, gee, if you have no problem doing it, maybe, yeah, if you do that, that'd be great. He said, super, I'll do it. He spins around in his desk. He picks up an old desk phone. He dials HR. He said, would you please send me Gary's next paycheck? Thanks. And he turned around. I was like, what? He said, Gary, we do the stuff we like for free. We get paid to do the stuff we don't like. And he said, that's something you don't like. I'm not going to like it, but I'm going to get paid for it. And if you're not going to do it, I want your pay for doing that. I said, I'll do it right away. And that served me well then. And it served me well in conversations since then when I've had those same issues. Because nobody your first time you terminate someone, it's a nightmare. You're up all night. You're throwing up. It's just horrible. And so sometimes you need a little pep talk. And that was the one I got. And it stood me in good stead ever since.
Oh, and I think too, one of the things I appreciate that I heard from you is just the humanity of it. If there wasn't that human element, firing people would be easy. But to your point, she was older. She had a family, older than you, had a family, and here you are up at night, but not forgetting the humanity side of it is super important. Okay, so if I'm hearing correct, so you start out kind of on one path in your career. When did you know you really had this entrepreneurial bug?
I didn't know. I think it's safe to say I had no idea. I'm not sure I could spell entrepreneur, but what I'm sure of is when I graduated business school, my first desire was to figure out how to make sure my now wife would marry me if I asked her to marry me. And I'd mentioned to her, if you could live anywhere she's in law school down in Texas, if you could live anywhere you wanted to live in the U.S., where would that be? And she didn't take long to say San Francisco. So I went back to graduate school and I wandered into the placement office. I said, well, what do we have in San Francisco? And it was 2 big department store chains. And since I've grown up, my family in the retail furniture business, I said, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And that's what I did. But once I got into the department store business and I started to understand it and I started to go into our stores and malls, I was realizing that specialty stores were popping up in the malls that were stealing our lunch at department stores. Stores like the Gap, all of a sudden there went our denim business. Lane Bryant, there went our large size business. I could run right jewelry. There were Zales, there went our jewelry business. And I started developing a point of view about department stores that were so fragmented with different names in each city you go to. The major department stores had a different name, even though they were owned by the same large company. So I started lobbying. I started with 2 things. One, we're getting our lunch taken. And if you can't see it, here's the data. And there was data that just, we were growing at 10%. Well, that was great, but the specialty stores were growing 40, 50% a year. And it was crazy. It was just very obvious what was going on. And I developed a point of view that said in any category of consumer goods that reaches measurable size being $1 billion back at that time. So a specialty channel will emerge that will end up being an important, if not dominant, channel of distribution inside that segment. And I could prove it with data. So I went on this big tear inside of Federated Department Stores, telling anyone who'd listen, guys, we're a dinosaur heading into the swamp, and we don't have to be. If we had a national name, we could compete with the limited by being called Macy's coast to coast, or pick a name, but everywhere. We could develop the programs. We could do everything to compete. Well, when my business school buddy, we played poker every week and we were on the same little section there. He had just been moved to the Silicon Valley to start working with video game publishers. And he was coming through Dallas in some business, and we were dear friends. So he came over for dinner and we sat at the kitchen table, and he showed me all the data about the coming video game and computers in the home, all the penetration curves going back to the first record players, to the first black and white TVs, to the first alarm clocks. The penetration curves were the same. And he said, there is no way video game machines and the software that goes on them is not going to become an enormous sector. There was not a single video game store in the world. So he's pushing on an open door with me, because I have been preaching to anyone who would listen that in any category of consumer products that reaches measurable size, the specialty store channel will be an important, if not dominant, channel of distribution. And I told him all that. I explained, Jim, this is really interesting. Let me tell you why. And by the time we were through, it's like, well, Jim, you got to quit your job at Bain. I have to quit my job at Federated Department Stores, and we got to do this. And he's like, really? And I'm like, yeah, really? So I go home my wife said, what? I said, hey, wait, if Jim does it, because Jim was top of the class in our business school. If Jim thinks it's a good idea, that's our insurance policy. Jim was, of course, going and telling his buddies, Kusin being a retailer, he thinks it's a good thing. So we both quit our jobs, and the rest is history. And so when we opened our first store, it's the first software store in the history of the world. We had so much fun for the next 12 years until I jumped to start the cosmetics company. And we had gone public, and we just bought our biggest competitor, and it felt like the right time. And somewhere in there, towards the end of Babbage's, I realized I could do something else. And I just enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of coming up with what's the hypothesis, or what's the investment thesis if you're in private equity, coming at something very rationally. And I had been meeting, because I still had a little bit of department store blood in my veins. I'd been meeting kind of quarterly with the CEO of Neiman Marcus back then, who was here in Dallas and lived down the street from me. And I'd ask him anything new, and he would always say, nope, nothing new. But all of a sudden, one time at lunch, he said, let me tell you about this company called MAC Cosmetics. And I had cosmetics responsibility. And when he was talking to me, my brain started working. Oh my gosh. And I had a whole idea about what it might mean. And that's when I figured out I'm probably more of an entrepreneur than I give myself credit for being. And that's where we went from there.
That is awesome. That is one of the coolest stories. Oh my gosh. I'm going to shift gears ever so slightly. you talk about, 1,000 hours in mentorship conversation, and that's you mentoring others, correct?
Yes, I probably needed it for myself, but I was too dumb to know better.
Oh, you're doing just fine, I think. So talk me through both sides of that. When do you recommend that somebody starts looking at a mentor? What do you look for in a mentor? How do you know they're the right person? What are the expectations to get out of that? And then we'll go to the flip side about where you focus, etc.
Super. Well, I think it's important to know that, and I will tell you, as I got into mentoring, it was very organic. It's people I had worked with. It was family members. It was people who knew me, who called me and said, I've got this thing going on. I need some advice. And that's how it kind of started, as opposed to, I never have mentored someone we're going to meet once a quarter. We're going to go to Starbucks. That's not me. But the last few years, as the pace of this has picked up, and I've started realizing actually the dangers of some mentoring, I am becoming more of a student of mentoring. And I'll just tell you, I have some real issues with the use of the word mentoring and corporations who, as part of their leadership and development, organizationally set up mentoring relationships. Now, I'm in favor of all that because it sounds good and it should be part of any leadership development. But there is a very large risk. I know from the other side of the table, as a CEO of companies that had 25,000 or more employees, I have seen what bad things can happen if you use the word mentor. And these are not exact numbers, but I'm going to say somewhere between a third and 40% of the times that I have gotten a call from someone in a corporate setting who really needed to talk with something about me, at least a third to 40% of them had to do with hostile environment, had to do with illegal goings on. And so let me tell you why I immediately get very upset about that. Now imagine if you are a mentor and I am your mentee and I tell you, I don't know what to do with this, but my friend and my peer is having an affair with my boss. Now, let's just say in that situation, you are dear friends with that boss and you can't believe what you just heard. Now you are in trouble because you have a duty as a senior officer of a big corporation to report to HR if there's malfeasance, hostile environment, anything like that. Well, if it's a third to 40% of every mentoring situation, it's my belief that companies should not use the word mentor or mentee. It suggests a confidentiality, which is not true. It can't be true in a corporate environment, but it suggests things that can't be delivered. And especially and my heart goes out to young people in a career, trying to build a career for themselves, who maybe they stumbled into a relationship with someone higher up in the company, or who knows? I've seen every permutation of this you can do. But so I'm an advocate of using the word coach. And this isn't just semantics, because if you asked 100 people what it means to be a mentor and 100 people what it means to be a coach, you're going to get a very narrowed scope for a coach. There's something very specific. They've got a very specific skill set and they can teach that. So maybe there's a work group in an area, in the IT area, that's coding and doesn't quite, they got to work through things. Well, their coach should have been there before. So they can sit down and tell people, okay, in this situation, here's what you do. And you can multiply that by every functional area of a company, because a coach has a very narrow purview. And as a potential mentee, I don't have to tell you, if you're my coach, about something about someone just got a kickback in my work group and they're going to open a restaurant with it. I mean, I've seen that one too. So I worry a lot. A lot of the people in the corporate environments who have ended up on my doorstep, I wasn't their first doorstep. They realized in their mentoring session, red flag goes up, and I can't have this conversation, but I need to have it because I don't know what to do. And that's where they end up on my doorstep. And that's why I have this thing about mentoring is not so wonderful if it's not really thought out up front. And what could go wrong, all those issues. Jill and I, who's my co-host on our podcast, is about mentoring. And in fact, it's eavesdropping on mentoring sessions we're having with people so the listener can hear honest God, real mentoring sessions. We are talking about having CEO, and we both know a bunch of them, CEOs of really interesting companies on, to talk with them about leadership and development on their watch. How do they think about it? Throw out this hot sports opinion I have about mentoring being risky, and get feedback, because maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are ways that they do it that is safer, but I never paid attention because I wasn't out there advertising myself as a mentor. I was just getting inbounds, and the more inbounds I got, the more I got, and it grew. And the next thing I know, the people that I talked to 3 years ago call and said, "Hey, you helped me 3 years ago. I got a bigger situation now." And next thing you know, I've been mentoring some people for 15 years, but only episodic, and only if it's something that they didn't see coming and that really it's an issue.
This has been super cool. I so appreciate your time. As we kind of start thinking about wrapping up, anything else we haven't touched on that you want to make sure that we do?
No, I've read your website, and I've listened into some of the things you put up on YouTube, and I'm so glad you guys do this. I mean, I think what y'all are doing is awesome. There is something that I feel close to when I hire people. You talk about helping people get better and intensity and all that. And how do you get the energy up to do what needs to be done? We put a big accent on this in companies I'm involved in on hiring. What do you look for? And because I think so much of this can be, if you are interviewing against that as a skill set, you stand a better chance of having people come into the company that are emotionally set up for what you want to do. And for instance, in a turnaround situation like we had at Kinko's, we interviewed for kind of 4 things as mission critical, and that we have to have a point of view after you spend an hour with a potential new person in the company. You got to have a point of view about these things. One is energy level. Did they feel like they had energy? Do they feel like they're going to bring it every day to work? Intellectual curiosity. Okay. Do they ask interesting questions? Do they wonder about things? 3, and this is really important. I'll tell you why this is my most high aspiration. If I'm interviewing someone and I say, what's your end of the rainbow job? And if they'd say something like your job, I want your job. It's like, boom, you're hired, because I need someone with really high aspirations. And then the 4th, which sounds a little weird, but I found it to really be true. If I talk to someone and I don't feel like they're driven to win, that's fine, as long as I do feel that they will refuse to lose. And those are 2 very different thoughts. Because sometimes people who are hyper competitive and they got to win. Well, maybe too much glass is going to get broken. But if someone refuses to lose, that's a different thing. That's when they're in the middle of the night and they're thinking about something. They go, nope, I'm not going to let this happen. And when I mentioned the high aspiration, probably the most proud thing, and I'll leave it at this, that I've had in my business career, 13 people on my turnaround team at Kinko's are CEOs. Mm. And that to me is an incredible tribute to them, because they were all of these. They refused to lose at a minimum. They had high aspirations. They were intellectually curious, and they made stuff happen. High energy. It works.
That's incredible. Man, thank you so much for sharing that. And I really appreciate your time and availability today. This has been, for lack of a better word, energizing, but also very insightful. So thank you, Gary.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoy this podcast, please make sure to subscribe. And to stay updated on everything that the Action Catalyst is up to, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Action Catalyst Podcast, and on Twitter at Catalyst_Action. And as always, thanks for listening.